Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's begin. Welcome to this meeting on the consultation meeting on Action 14, Dispute Resolution. Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Andrew Dawson. I'm the chairman of Working Party 1, the group that's taking forward this action item. And it's been taken forward particularly by a subgroup which is been chaired by Claudine de Villiers from Belgium, and I'm going to be handing over to her in a moment to make some substantive comments on the work so far. So my job is, as those of you who've been here for the last 2 days will know, is just to make some general comments about the process and the way that we will conduct the day. You've all got in front of you, I hope, an agenda and a list of participants. And we will be following the agenda with one small exception, which I'll come to in a moment. The purpose of the day is for us to hear what you have to say. We've received the comments on the paper that we put out last month. Thank you very much for those. We've had extensive comments on all the actions that we're taking forward, and we are very grateful for the trouble that you've taken to make comments in writing and also to come here today. And we're very conscious of the value of the time, and we're very appreciative of that. Those of you who are sitting at the table should be at least people who have made written comments. If you're on the back row, it will generally mean that you're either with someone who's on the front row or that you have not made written comments. But you are all very welcome. If you want to take the floor, please just raise your flag like this and put it on the end, and I will acknowledge you. When you wish to speak, you press the red button on this console in front of you that activates your microphone. When you do that, it'll switch off any other microphones or only one can be on at any one time. So it will switch off the other microphones. So when you've finished speaking, there's no need to turn it off. Otherwise, we'll just get into some fight. So just leave the microphone when you finish speaking, please. If you are on the back row and you don't have access to a console, just please raise your hand and indicate that you want to speak. And we've set up microphones. Actually, I don't see it, but there's I see the stand. I don't see the microphone. They haven't proved very popular over the last 2 days, I have to say, the microphones in the corner. But the purpose of the microphones in the corner is that if you go to them, you will be caught on TV. And that's the other thing to say, that this meeting is being webcast, and welcome to anybody who is viewing us over the internet. It's being webcast and it's being recorded so that you can see the things that you said when you get home this evening by going to video.oecd.org. If you go to the microphones in the corner, you will be picked up on the webcam. That's the point of putting them there. So I think that's probably all I need to do. Just to say, in case I forgot a moment ago, that the purpose of this meeting is really for us to hear your comments. There are government representatives on this side of the table, and we could, I dare say, respond to any questions you have. But it's mainly, we're interested in your views and your opinions of what we've done. So, without any further ado, let me hand over to Claudine de Villiers from Belgium, who's been heading this work. Claudine.
Thank you, Andrew. So, I had prepared some slides, but it seems that it's a difficulty to have them on the screen, so we will do without. It's not a problem. It's a very general presentation. Ah, here they are. So, thank you. The next one, yeah. So, we will first see why, in fact, we need Action 14, which is an important complement to the BEPS Action Plan and to the other BEPS actions. In fact, as it was clear the previous days, other BEPS action may result and will result in increased uncertainty and therefore increase disputes. There will be a lot of measures that will result from these other actions that will be applicable at the same time, and sometimes try to solve same difficulties, so increase uncertainty. And for the moment, dispute resolution is not always seen as functioning as well as it should. There are difficulties foreseen, at least for the moment, and so those difficulties could expand. Also, for some countries, at least, agreement to the other BEPS actions are in a way conditioned by the fact that we will solve effectively the disputes that will result from this action and have an effective dispute resolution mechanism. We have OECD statistics on the process of the mutual agreement procedures, and there we can see that the case inventory have steadily increased. It passed from 2,000 and something to 4,000, more than 4,000 in 2013. It decreased regularly from 10% each year. And with the BEPS actions, this increase will really continue, or it seems. Also, we can see that some cases are closed or withdrawn without eliminating double taxation, without finding a solution. It seems that it's about 9% of the cases, and that is a big uncertainty, even if most of the cases are really solved. It creates uncertainty for enterprises. We don't know where they will be, in the 90% of the cases, or at the cases that will not be solved. Also, the average number of months to complete a MAP case are around 24 months, which doesn't seem so much, but it means that there are, among those cases, cases that last more than that. And those 24 months that exist for the moment exist still at the beginning. It was almost always the same amount. It was not improved. So here, what are we required from Action 14? Clearly, what we are required to do is to make dispute resolution mechanisms more effective. For that, develop solutions to address obstacles that are foreseen in the mechanism, and including obstacles, one of the obstacles being the absence of arbitration. Another obstacles that is rather important is that sometimes access to MAP is denied in some cases. So we discussed, as of September 2013, I think we started to discuss rather early on this action, try to find out how to solve the issue. It was rather difficult to achieve a consensus on the approach. So here the approach that is foreseen is a three-pronged approach. First one is a political commitment at a high political level, a political commitment to implement an effective dispute resolution mechanism. The second part of the approach is the commitment to implement recommended solution to improve the mechanism, practical solution that will be proposed for the moment. And the third part is a commitment to monitor implementation of the political commitment and the practical solution. So a review of what happens are those commitments fulfilled? Here the paper discussed very briefly the approach, presented it. Most of the paper discussed the second commitment, the commitment to implement recommended solution to improve the map. There, at the beginning, some countries and the OECD thought that arbitration is an efficient solution, an efficient tool to solve disputes. However, we discussed it at several levels, at the focus group level, WP1 level, Bureau Plus, CFA, and in practice, it resulted that some countries are clearly opposed to arbitration being the solution, the standard that all countries should adopt. So it was not a route that seemed to be a solution. We cannot discuss lengthily. We discussed already during a long time, so we have to find concrete solution. So we try to find complementary solution to improve the existing rules, work on the text of the article, the commentary, and ensure that best practices that are already there and others are implemented by tax administrations. To do that work, we highlighted 4 guiding principles to have in mind when examining the possible solution. The first one is to ensure that treaty obligation to resolve dispute is fully implemented in good faith. It's an obligation under the treaty. Yes, it's an obligation to endeavor to solve cases, but this should not be lightly taken. So here, the object of the work is to have a commitment, a strong one, and not only solution on paper, but that it will be implemented effectively. The second guiding principle is to ensure that tax administration practices promote the prevention and resolution of disputes. There we have highlighted some tools, solution, and also work is undertaken under the FTA MAP forum of competent authority of some tax administration who work really and effectively on this issue. They had a meeting in December, and it showed that there is really a willingness to cooperate and to improve things at the level of tax administration's practices. The second guiding principle is to ensure that taxpayer can access MAP when eligible, because it's no need to have arbitration if the case doesn't go to MAP, if MAP is accessed from the very beginning, or if it's considered as the objection of the taxpayer is not justified. So that's an important consideration that has to be taken into consideration, access to MAP. And of course, the fourth guiding principle is to ensure that cases are resolved when they are in MAP. There, as I said, best practices favor multilateral MAPs and APAs, and also arbitration for those that are willing, prepared to go for arbitration. And maybe, as some have difficulties to go for arbitration for all the cases, to work on some alternative, allowing them to go for arbitration even if it's for limited cases. So also to work on it for those that are prepared to go that route. Here, was the aim of the paper and the public consultation is to present the three-pronged approach, to present and list the possible recommended solution, the options to improve the map, and to get your comments on those issues and also on other possible solutions that we have not foreseen and not listed, and to allow us to continue the work. And here, what is in the paper that are options. We will list options as largely as possible. And at the end, those options will be considered at the level of the G20. And the G20 will decide which of these options will be recommendation that countries should implement in order to fulfill their commitment to effectively solve dispute resolution, and which will be considered when the monitoring will be put in place and review if the commitment is fulfilled. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudine. And now I'm going to pass the floor to Will Morris from BEAC to make some general remarks.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Andrew and Claudine, particularly for those very helpful, that very helpful outline, and to Jacques and to Marlies and to all of the government delegates for the opportunity to speak here this morning at this consultation on dispute resolution, and to offer a few opening remarks on behalf of BEAC and the OECD business community. First, and I know for those of you who've been here for all 3 days, I've used pretty identical language at the other consultations. I do want to acknowledge the effort and the thought that's gone into this discussion draft, particularly given the almost impossible deadlines under which all of you have been operating. And I also want to acknowledge, and this is very important, that we both understand and appreciate, again, that this is an early draft which has been put out, which is not a consensus document, and which doesn't represent a polished conclusion. Instead, you did respond to our requests for an early opportunity for us and for other stakeholders to engage in dialogue with you. And finally, I do also want to acknowledge, again, how open the process of consultation with all stakeholders has been, and the genuine effort which has also clearly gone into that. So again, thank you for that. Let me just say a general word or two and then raise a couple of specific issues which we do explore again at length, greater length in our comment letter. I think it's very important to highlight that achieving a successful outcome to this action item is a critical factor in the success of the entire BEPS program. It's not because this action item itself deals with base erosion and profit shifting, but it is because it provides the necessary predicate, the necessary conditions for all of those BEPS items to be successfully dealt with. BEAC believes that for the BEPS project to succeed, two things must happen. The first is countries must be willing to truly support the project, and the second is that business must be prepared to fully accept its outcomes. And improved dispute resolution is a necessary condition for both of those. Why? Well, in relation to countries, I think there's going to be an unwillingness for some to participate in some of the actions, if the BEPS recommendations are viewed as giving a strategic advantage to another country. This advantage could come either in terms of enhanced revenue seen as being taken from the first country, or the advantage could come from the second country favouring its own taxpayers. Most observers have acknowledged that the BEPS project is likely to result in significantly increased instances of conflicting tax claims by countries. Therefore, a robust and widely supported dispute resolution mechanism aimed at ensuring fair and predictable application of the newly agreed standards will give countries the confidence that their tax and revenue base can be protected from the unilateral actions of other countries, and, following from that, the confidence to enter into commonly agreed recommendations across the whole range of BEPS items. And it should be said that this is more important now because the very welcome inclusion of many new countries in the consensus-forming process nevertheless means that participants understandably lack experience with another's commitment to applying mutually agreed standards. And in relation to business, success on this dispute resolution action is also crucial for the success of the BEPS project as a whole. The concerns that we raised in these set of comments and in all our other comments about the risks of double taxation, which can discourage cross-border trade and investment, remain crucial. And it should be said that these are equally important for countries themselves who are anxious for foreign investment and for the ongoing success of their businesses. But I think there's also a different and perhaps more basic reason why this action item must succeed in the eyes of business. The BEPS outcomes, as we already said, will likely raise taxes on many businesses and impose significant new reporting and compliance burdens on most. That is understood by business. However, if the process also gives rise to a significant increase in cases of double taxation, the BEPS plan may fail for the simple reason that, if businesses do not feel they're being treated fairly, they will seek new ways to mitigate that double taxation. Put slightly differently, however many hard law aspects of BEPS are enacted, if the trust between businesses and government, which is at the heart of cooperative compliance, breaks down, then we could find ourselves back in the adversarial situation that cooperative compliance sought to end. And, I hope we all agree, that would be to the substantial disadvantage of both parties. So, only if business feels that the new rules that will significantly increase burdens are balanced with an effective guarantee that their profits are not caught up in costly, lengthy, and potentially unresolvable disputes between states, will businesses be able to fully concur in the project's conclusions. Moving to specific issues, our own BEAC comments are relatively brief, although we do support the more detailed comments that many of our members have sent in, as well as ICC's ongoing work in the arbitration area. I did nevertheless want to pick out one or two particularly important points from those comments. Firstly, as this is primarily an issue of tax administration, and as tax authorities have the greater interest in maintaining cooperative compliance models, we believe that the FTA, and in particular the MAP Forum, should be central rather than parallel to this process. The FTA can make a real difference here. Secondly, I'm afraid we don't think that a political commitment is enough. There have to be robust mechanisms and processes actually brought into effect as a direct outcome of the BEPS process. Thirdly, binding arbitration is a critical part of any solution. We do understand that some countries have genuine concerns, but that is not a reason for binding arbitration not to be the general standard for countries that are fully committed to avoiding double taxation. We also think that the MAP process must be properly resourced, particularly if there are going to be increased numbers of disputes, and also that the MAP process must be suitably positioned in the structure of a tax authority. And finally, we've surveyed our members on their actual experiences with MAP in their countries and the practical issues which can arise, and those survey results are attached to our comments. Before closing, can I just say something to my business colleagues as well? The first is thanks. Thanks so much to all of you for coming today and throughout this week, and for all of the incredible hard work and good work that you've put into drafting comments. Many of you have put heart and soul into this. And I know that that's actually incredibly important for this process, that it be not one-sided or not necessarily adversarial, but something which is constructive. Secondly, however, I do also ask you, however strongly you feel about this topic, and I know many of you rightly feel very strongly, please keep the tone constructive and respectful. We can and should be robust on this topic. But we should also never forget that the government representatives themselves are under huge pressure in this BEPS project, and that we do actually have a common aim here, governments, business, and civil society, and that's a better, more stable international tax system that actually encourages growth in cross-border trade and investment, which is for the common good. So again, to the government delegates, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here this morning on this absolutely critical subject, and we really do look forward to working with you on this action item to bring it, we hope, to a successful conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will, for those comments. Before we move to the more specific items on the agenda, I've had a request to speak from Philippe Thirier, who speaks on behalf of MEDEF, the French business group, who is going to speak for a few minutes and give us some general comments. So, Philippe, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am from MEDEF, which is the business association in France. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to give you a few general suggestions or recommendations from the enterprise on the map. MAP is about, sorry. Well, we respond to the invitation that is on page 4 or the document from OECD, and the action to counter BEPS must be complemented with action that ensure certainty and predictability for business. I would add certainty and predictability for government too, I think. This is, in that way, we are in the same boat. MAP is about finding resolution of dispute between two states on the proper way to tax M&E, which is not legally part of the dispute. And we would like to introduce enterprise into the scope of the MAP study, not only within the various stages of MAP, offering each taxpayer to participate into the different phases of the procedure, but in studying the very core of the procedure and the way it must work. The enterprise should be taken into account in defining the aim and the means of MAP. And what are the main expectations of the business? They can be described in three elements: a quick solution, a clear and meaningful solution, and a solution at all. I will treat these 3 points in a minute, but I would like to state what the background. It has been about by the representative of Belgium, but presently, in the present situation, MAP is not working in a satisfactory way, in spite of all the good work that has been made by OECD some years ago. The process is long, too long for the time of business. The representative of Belgium say that 24 months, but 24 months is MAP, and you have to add up the audit period, and you add up all the period before the audit, between the audited period and the starting of the audit. So at the end, you have 5 or 6 years. Arbitration clause has not been largely adopted, as some countries are reluctant to adopt it, it has to say. And some MAP procedures do not find a solution because the states are not able to find a solution. The number of disputes is regularly growing, even without the effect of BEPS actions. And those actions will increase because of BEPS. It will increase in 2 ways: the number of cases in a dramatic way, and the variety of cases adding up new types of issues. We have new type of transfer pricing issue. We have treaty shopping issue, hybrid issue, PEs issues. And this means for us that while improving the procedure as proposed in the document, a renewed approach should be considered. Tax authorities should devote less time to each case, because FTA said you have to do more with less, by adopting a more technical approach with a more middle-term view, instead of trying just to resolve case by case a few cases. So I will see 3 points. 3 points, which is quick solution. We will see the time frame. A clear, meaningful solution. We will see the content of the solution, and a solution, which is arbitration. Time frame. There could be no certainty, no predictability for the business if dispute resolution takes too long. Transfer pricing is a day-to-day issue, and is the same for other issues. When a practice is used by the M&A, is challenged by tax authority, the business has to go on anyway with this practice during the whole process, not knowing what will be the solution, if any, provided several years after. For isolated issues, some of them could be repeated in the long run, the M&A is under the threat of double taxation, which will impact in financial account for a long period. So we propose a tight timetable for the whole process. And a parallel, the possibility to have all the phases of the process to be pursued in parallel. The taxpayer can trigger the maps 6 months after it's received a written and motivated document from its tax authority raising a double taxation issue. 6 months later, the taxpayer can, if he wants, ask for the arbitration procedure to be triggered, which means that the government has to begin to create the arbitration body, commission or anything. Competent authorities have 6 months to build up the arbitration body, and so it gives 1 year to pursue the map. The map procedure is going. 5 minutes. The arbitration body should conclude within 6 months. This implies that each stages of the procedure can be dealt in parallel, I say. For us, the map procedure should be differentiated according to the type of problem. A typology or classification of cases would be done. We can select the simple case. We can select a certain class, a new class, I would say, of cases that are typical and that raise the same sort of difficulty, and you have the other case. So that we can create, or you can create, sorry, a fast track for the simple case, or specialist person could be devoted to a specific question that are our technical nature and etc. Second point, a technical content. We can no longer accept that everybody cannot accept any longer that each case is treated as a sort of bargaining and sometime or try to find a quick solution just to put an end to the dispute. Everybody has to build up a quality solution, strong solution. And what is a valid technical solution? We need the analysis of the problem, motivation of the solution, and in motivation we will have general principle that would appear and particular aspects, and the general solution will be used and useful for the rest of the time, the other states and the other taxpayer. For the M&E, we need an applicable solution for the year following the challenge years, as long as the conditions are the same, and especially on transfer pricing, because there are a lot of years that during which the M&E has pursued applying its policy, and an opportunity for M&E to re-examine its transfer pricing policy or other policy. For the competent authorities, it's a way to learn from experience on the particular problem and general principles, and to create a set of decisions that will be available when examining future disputes by the state, by the competent authority, and maybe by the other competent authority. And for both, it will allow to create a technical context that will provide certainty and maybe predictability. Last point. Arbitration is a powerful way to resolve disputes, and is absolutely necessary. We should find together remedies against the prevention of some states. They have sometimes formal and constitutional argument, and sometimes it's political argument. We would just suggest a few tracks. First, sovereignty. Most disputes will be of a pure technical nature, or most of them will have a technical side which is the most important in it. And so solution will be less emotional and more symmetrical in the long run, in the long term. I think it is very important to stop treating the file as a case by case, year by year. We have to have a long perspective. Anyway, tax convention is about reducing sovereignty, so arbitration is just an epsilon more. And why not ask a group of external experts to provide a new solution to bring light on the issue within or not the arbitration clause? About arbitrators, it's easy to find neutral arbitrators. They are available. There are a lot of them of whom we can say they are neutral. And they can propose new solutions. The advantage of arbitration is that arbitrators or external experts will bring new solution, a new view. It's true in every arbitration cases, even in commercial law, and a new solution can gather the agreement of two fighting states. And a worldwide organization, maybe, for instance, OECD, could be asked to give some help on that. So my conclusion is very, very, very simple. If we go at the technical level, and it will become more and more technical because of the BEPS action. And if we take a long-term or middle-term view and not try to cope with the pile of files in the office, we think that the competent authorities and the MNEs have exactly the same interest, the same view, and we are ready to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And I hope that leads quite nicely into the next section, which we've called Promoting Arbitration and the Three-Pronged Approach. And Carol Donoghue is going to speak. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thanks. I am Carol Donoghue. I'm here today on behalf of the International Alliance for Principal Taxation, from which you've heard already this week several times. We'd like to cover a series of topics here today. I will condense some of the slides because some of the points have already been covered by others. But we would like to start just by speaking to the importance of effective dispute resolution. Two perspectives. First, from a business perspective, many businesses really do see Action 14 as the most important part of the action plan, the linchpin that will make everything else work. I think that's been noted by others. And we think it really is essential to the viability and the sustainability of the BEPS outcomes. Businesses simply cannot operate internationally if their profits are subject to double or multiple taxation. Taxes are a cost of doing business, and where cost of doing business is too high or unexpected after the fact, businesses cannot, as a practical matter, cope with that. So to avoid impeding trade or investment internationally, there really has to be adequate certainty that disputes will be resolved, and that certainty has to be provided in advance so that businesses can know it will occur. And we believe that requires the implementation of effective procedures. We believe that tax administrations also need procedures to address growing disputes more effectively with their available resources. I have been saying this for many years. I'm a former competent authority myself, a former treaty negotiator, and I've been working in the MAP area and other international dispute resolution area for more than 20 years. So I do think that this is a shared need of all concerned, and improvements to dispute resolution will benefit tax administrations as well as taxpayers. We believe to get there, what we need is a real commitment to resolve disputes and the actual implementation of appropriate measures to ensure that that happens. The MAP process, we think, is really at a breaking point already in many countries. I won't repeat the statistics that Claudine already shared with us this morning, but MAP case requests have almost doubled in less than 10 years. They were up 12% overall across the OECD member countries that report their results to the OECD each year. And new requests are very consistently outpacing case resolutions, so the inventories continue to grow. We've already noted, I think everyone has noted, that we're expecting new disputes to arise as the BEPS Action Plan is implemented, because it does involve some novel concepts. We think that is occurring already in many countries. We're already seeing assessments that refer to BEPS or that apply BEPS concepts, and so the increase in the difficulty of the new disputes is already occurring. So we fully agree with the agenda for today for this section that a step change is needed in this area. We think there are several conditions that need to be satisfied in order to achieve improvement, and we've listed those here. We think that the dispute resolution procedures need to apply automatically and not be subject to the exercise of discretion on a case-by-case basis. They need to be carefully designed to avoid the risk of inaction or the prospect of deadlock. They need to be protected against unprincipled external influences that may come to the fore in particular cases, so that they can operate consistently and without that kind of influence. They need to be implemented, actually implemented, and that needs to happen really without much delay, because we are already in a very serious situation, I think, all of us. And they have to actually operate successfully. The results do matter. The three-pronged approach, declaration, commitment, and monitoring, we agree that those are all necessary parts of the solution, and we think the working group has done a lot of good work in that area. We agree with almost all of the options that are proposed. Our comments note a few concerns, and so we certainly support that. The only thing is we don't think it goes far enough. Declaration, commitment, and monitoring alone won't be sufficient really to achieve the necessary improvements. We think that commitment alone in particular has not proven effective in the past, and we would submit that there are two important factors that are missing so far from what has been put on the table. One is a way to ensure that appropriately designed improvements are actually implemented and applied, and one is a mechanism for monitoring the situation. We recognize that the three-pronged approach references briefly the possibility of monitoring through the MAP forum, the FTA MAP forum, and we think that would be a good idea. We do think it needs to monitor the outcomes and not just the staffing or what have you. Those are important points, but the actual success is really going to be key here. We don't think minor changes are going to produce any material improvements, and so we respectfully suggest that further work is needed on Action 14. I think we agree with Claudine on that, and we would encourage the group to be more ambitious and more creative in that area. We'd like to just say a few words about the benefits of arbitration here, just to be frank about this. Business was concerned about the discussion of arbitration in the discussion draft because it fell short of the expectations that had been created by the action plan. And we're concerned because arbitration really is the only mechanism that has been proven effective in ensuring the resolution of disputes. I'd like to note that the U.S.-Canada experience on arbitration, I think, is informative here. It's been statistically documented. We refer to this in our comments. The Canadian Competent Authority publishes each year its MAP case statistics. Virtually all of those cases are with the U.S. The rate of resolution has gone from something in the vicinity of 80 or 85% to 98% since these arbitration provisions were enacted. And both the U.S. and Canadian competent authorities have, throughout the years where we've been applying these procedures, publicly stated their support for the procedures and their belief that they have improved the operation of the MAP process. We think that arbitration also provides certainty and saves resources for all parties, including tax administrations. I led a group while I was competent authority, which designed the MAP procedures for the U.S. In something near the form that they have taken in the various treaties that the U.S. has applied. And we did that because we saw governmental interest in that kind of measure to improve dispute resolution. It was not because of some business interest, although businesses certainly do support this. We think that the appropriate design of arbitration provisions is really key to their proper functioning. That can be decided bilaterally to address particular issues. They do need to be mandatory and binding, we believe. We think that the last offer arbitration approach, such as what's in the U.S.-Canada treaty, does address sovereignty issues, constitutionality issues, and resource issues. And it's nothing like the commercial arbitration that people are concerned about, or a voluntary arbitration procedure, or even the EU multilateral arbitration convention. It operates completely differently, and so I commend that to your attention. We do think that there is a lot more that the working group could do to consider arbitration constructively, and we have noted in our comments there is some discussion there. We would distinguish legitimate concerns about arbitration on the basis of sovereignty, constitutionality, and resources from the sort of sovereignty arguments, general sovereignty arguments that really are aimed at preserving a unilateral ability to disregard treaty obligations. We think the latter type of sovereignty argument is effectively stating an intent to violate one's treaty obligations, and we submit that that would be inconsistent with international law. But there are legitimate concerns, and there is a lot that this group could do to address them, and we've included some recommendations in our comments. One word on alternatives to arbitration. We don't think there's any proven alternative. We agree with the comments from BEAC that arbitration should be adopted as the goal and implemented now by all countries that are committed to dispute resolution. Where there really are demonstrated concerns that need to be addressed, perhaps some sort of targeted peer monitoring of the MAP processes and the MAP results could be implemented as an interim measure. We would encourage all countries to publish their MAP statistics on a country-by-country basis for the benefit of their treaty partners and their potential investors, just so people have a sense of how well the process is working. So those are some alternatives to supplement arbitration, we hope, in the interim. I'll leave it at that. Happy to take questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carol. And we're going to move straight to your neighbour, I guess, on behalf of the ICC. So, Sim Lowell.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, countries, Secretary, thank you for the opportunity to appear. My name is Sim Lowell. I'm Vice Chairman of the International Chamber of Commerce Commission on Taxation. My colleague to your left is Helene von Lith, who's Secretary of the ICC Court of Arbitration. with broad experience in administering alternative dispute resolution procedures for many years. As you all know, the ICC represents business in virtually every country of the world. It's interesting in history that the ICC began the tax treaty process and dispute resolution in 1923. Needless to say, the world has changed a lot since 1923, and when the ICC started that process, it was both looking at treaties and what we now call transfer pricing, and also dispute resolution. And in those initial proposals in 1923 came up with means of resolving taxation disputes. Well, the League of Nations took over the treaty part of that process in 1926 and ended up what we have today in terms of the OECD and the UN model treaties. The ICC continued the arbitration and dispute resolution process and becoming one of the world's leading facilitators of those kinds of processes. And within the ICC, both the Taxation Commission and the Arbitration Commission, we know that there's broad experience in making dispute resolution processes work. Some positive benefits, some negative benefits. We all know that lots of different kinds of dispute resolution procedures create both opportunities and problems. And from our standpoint, when we were looking forward to action item number 14, discussion draft coming forward, we were very hopeful that there would be a substantive improvement, as my predecessors in comments have said, of the process, because it doesn't work very well in lots of circumstances for the reasons indicated. We had hope because we know that there's gold standard opportunities in other areas that could be applied in the taxation context. Frankly, when we looked at the discussion draft that came out in December, we, like almost all other business organizations, were disappointed for two reasons. One is, as opposed to having an actual solution or a prescribed way forward, the discussion draft is largely a precatory document in terms of saying we could do this and we could do that, which to me at least suggests the absence of a political commitment in the countries to actually implement a dispute resolution process. The second reason we were concerned was there is knowledge outside of the tax area of how to create a gold standard for dispute resolution in the tax context. Now, as we sit here today, of course, the ICC, we agree with all the other business commentators that the three-prong approach is an excellent way forward. We need to have standards, we need to have monitoring, and we need for the multilateral instrument to have an effective way of dealing with these issues. Within the ICC, we started a process of coordinating with our arbitration colleagues to understand how all different kinds of commercial arbitration have been addressed over the past many years to get to the point that these dispute resolution procedures, including arbitration, are generally accepted throughout the world. And I note that many of the countries that object to arbitration in a tax context regularly engage in such dispute resolution procedures in other contexts. So you've heard enough from tax people. I think it's important to hear from people who are expert in administering dispute resolution programs, including arbitration. And Helene Van Leith is responsible for this within the International Chamber of Commerce. And as I said, we started a process of trying to distill out of that experience the things we could use to have a gold standard in the tax context. And we don't have much time before you have to report to the G20, but there's enough time to come up with a process that would actually work. Helene?
Thank you. I have been asked to quickly draw certain parallels with the way it could be solved in a taxation area. I have three very brief comments. The first one would be that international arbitration has really developed, firstly because of an increasing activity, cross-border activity. And when there is cross-border economic activity, you also really need an effective cross-border dispute resolution mechanism. And so that increased a lot. And the second reason really was that the traditional way of solving disputes through states or states' court didn't work because there was lack of political will or lack of, or at least a failure in harmonizing certain rules of jurisdiction and recognition of certain decisions. So arbitration became the alternative, but it actually became the only alternative to dispute resolution cross-border. This was also helped by the New York Convention that started with some of the states in very early 50s to ratify the convention, but it at the moment is actually being ratified by all other states, almost every state throughout the world. It is also very important, I would say, to note that the UN, in the body of the UNCITRAL, has actively been promoting any type of conciliation, dispute resolution, and arbitration as an effective means of dispute resolution, providing legal certainty for all actors. And since a few years and a few decades, we see not only the arbitrations increasing, but really also spreading out throughout the world, including all kinds of actors of emerging and developing states. The ICC works a lot on national committees, and we see a lot of national committees actively reaching out to us from emerging and developing states to become part of this dispute resolution mechanism. Now, I would just like to draw the attention to the importance of institutionalized arbitration, because it provides for certain safeguards and guarantees which should or hopefully could address the concerns that has been raised earlier by other commentators. Institutionalized arbitrations provides guarantees for impartiality of arbitrators, independency of arbitrators. This is done by most of the courts of the administration bodies or institutionalized arbitrations. There is a whole mechanisms and control on reducing costs, especially arbitrators' costs and institutionalized costs. Obviously, the biggest part of the cost is still the legal fees, but I would say that this is same in any other area. And then maybe the most important thing is also the very important role of a court or an institution which is able to scrutinize awards to see whether there is a right balance of due process and fair trial guarantees, which is also absolutely necessary to be able to be recognized under the New York Convention. Then my last point I would like to finish is to stress that there is, of course, arbitration as a mechanism of dispute resolution, but what is actually arbitration? This has already been said. It's a third party coming in as a neutral, often an expert, who either facilitates or decides. But there are lots of other neutral determinations within many dispute resolution bodies, which would include mediation, which helps as a third party, facilitating parties to come to agreement, or expert determination, which is an expert who will, on a very specific technical point, provide a binding or non-binding determination. And within the ICC, we had all kinds of other very, very tailor-made dispute resolution services, which would go to the WIPO, IP litigations, also involving states, to the DocDex rules, which is a very short and quick, but very highly expert resolution of documentary credits disputes. So I think what is important to stress is that where states have difficulties in overcoming certain problems, there is a very big and long-standing experience coming from input from all over the world and at many emerging and developing countries to actually have a third party coming in and help the parties.
Thank you, Helene. From the standpoint of the ICC, we stand ready to work with the Secretariat in any way that's appropriate to take that expertise and experience from all the different kinds of dispute resolution that Helene mentioned and put it into the context of something that worked for both for the monitoring, for the multilateral instrument, and for the three-prong approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both speakers for those remarks. I'd now like to open the floor for other comments on this item of the agenda. Please introduce yourself when you speak for the first time. I know the names of some people around the room, but not everybody. So forgive me if I just sort of point in your direction. But I do recognise the person behind the first flag that went up, which is, well, I'm not sure whether it's Manal Corwin or Peter Steeds. It's Manal Corwin.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm Manal Corwin. I'm with KPMG. Just a couple of points. One, on the political commitment recommendation in the document. I'm concerned about that particular recommendation, in particular because I think given the amount of effort and time that is being put into trying to address the charge in this action item, which is to try to improve dispute resolution, it struck me as not a sufficient or an appropriate recommendation to be part of the paper, mainly because I think any treaty, which is a contract between governments, there is an implied understanding that both countries will act in good faith and be politically committed to implement the charge under the treaty. So in my mind, the political commitment is already memorialized in the fact of the treaty, not only with respect to MAP, but with the other provisions. So to suggest that that's a new recommendation, it raises a concern as if that is not already understood as part of the treaty, and if anything, it should be included as it is understood that that is what countries do when they sign a treaty, and the commitment to MAP in the MAP article to resolve it needs to be honored, or that political commitment is needed to be honored. So that was just one point. I also am concerned about it because I think in many cases the sense that the problem with the reasons dispute resolutions, or sorry, the reasons that disputes arise and dispute resolution is difficult is because one of the parties is acting in good faith. There are many disputes that go unresolved that need resolution where both sides do believe that they are acting in good faith, and yet the dispute goes on, and all the concerns about the absence of effective dispute resolution mechanisms continue to exist. So I'm not sure it is a resolution that can deal with what some of businesses experience and what governments experience. And so having a discussion draft or solutions or recommendations that are more practical and specific towards addressing the inability to resolve disputes where both parties are acting in good faith and committed to resolution is as important, if not more important, to deal with it. So then, just on arbitration, I have a couple of points. I think, as just echoing some of the other comments that were made, I was concerned that it was the possibility of arbitration as a reasonable solution here was dismissed so quickly. I think that it was a missed opportunity. The absence of consensus around arbitration being a reasonable outcome of this work, I don't think was a good reason not to continue the discussion. The draft itself purported not to be a consensus document, and I think by not having it be part of the conversation, a continued part of the conversation, we missed the opportunity to have a robust discussion here with governments who were concerned about aspects of arbitration, the business perspective on it, the government perspective on it, and what specifically are the issues. I think my experience in speaking with government representatives who are concerned about arbitration have reflected that there isn't really a common language right now. When we talk about arbitration, different governments are thinking about different kinds of arbitration. Just this morning, in hearing comments from various people around the table, I think we were referring to several different kinds of arbitration. So when you have the conversation, the various objections or concerns about it sometimes are not about the same types. And there's EU arbitration, there's the kind that is in many US treaties, which is mandatory binding baseball arbitration and so forth. So to appropriately address concerns and see if you can get to resolution, we need to have a common language. We need to be able to lay out what types of arbitration there are, and then walk through the different objections and discuss them and determine whether, in fact, you can get to a consensus around one that would be appropriate for the majority, if not all participants or all members. Finally, I don't think it is an absolute necessity, though I think ideal, to get agreement out of this action item that arbitration, and in my view, mandatory binding arbitration that the U.S. has with many treaty partners and has been proven very effective. While that might be ideal, I don't think that the absence of complete consensus around it means that it ought to be discarded as part of, as a component of any outcome or recommendation from this action item. The OECD has had experience with circumstances where you set something as a gold standard, as something to aspire to, where you get a group of countries who are early adopters of an approach. It could be taken, it could be approached in that way. I recommend that we think about it in that way if you can't get complete consensus. And I do believe that over time, you could see folks adopting it as the issues are worked out. Outside of that, I do think to the extent it is a proven effective dispute resolution mechanism and it is considered a gold standard, to the extent that there are countries who feel for various reasons they cannot adopt it, one solution could be that they need to have an alternative that is viewed as, if they can't adopt arbitration, that they need, there is a burden of proof on the behalf of the countries who choose not to do it, that they have an alternative dispute resolution mechanism in place that is as effective, as timely, and so forth if they choose not to. So to me, there are multiple solutions, and I would like to see another opportunity, if at all possible, to bring government and business together to have a discussion that is robust, specifically about the types of arbitration and the specific concerns, so that we could work through some of those issues and see other possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manal. There was a forest of flags that all went up very quickly and around the same time. So I'm simply going to start there and work clockwise around the table. So please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my name is Tomaki from Japan Foreign Trade Council, which is a trade industry association with Japanese trading companies and trading organization as its core members. Members have traditionally been engaged in trading, but some of the members have evolved over the years to conduct a wider range of activities, such as logistics, finance, project planning, and especially the investment. So we would like to make some general comment regarding the draft. At first, we would like to show our support on Action Plan 14 and the ongoing effort of OECD to remove the various obstacles surrounding the MAP. International double taxation imposes significant economic burdens on taxpayers, and they must be eliminated in a prompt and sufficient manner. Paragraph 56 invites comments to identify other alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that could contribute to a more effective MAP. In this regard, we propose the development of a regime that obligates tax authorities to consult and mutually agree with the tax authority of the other state prior to raising any tax demands which are not in accordance with tax rates. Even if this proposal is found to be difficult, rules to eliminate double taxation should nevertheless be strengthened. The conclusion of tax treaties between countries should be promoted, and even if it is difficult to reach an agreement on the full provisions in concluding the tax treaty, priority should especially be given to agreement on provisions relating to the elimination of double taxation arising from transfer pricing legislations. Finally, we request for strong political commitment by all contracting states, and also for the improvement of administrative processes in each state in order to ensure the effectiveness of the MAP. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And is it Fidel? François Vincent, is it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is François Vincent. I'm with Fidel. It's a French law firm, approximately 1,400 lawyers. I guess the first comment, and this echoes some of the things that were already said by Will, by Carol, by others. It is very much a surprise and a disappointment that mandatory binding arbitration is not at the forefront of the discussion draft. The mutual agreement procedure, or MAP, is clearly beneficial to both taxpayers and tax administrations. And the fact that we would not put forward the best tool we have to actually solve the problems that are currently plaguing the MAP programs worldwide is in the context of BEPS, to me, is unacceptable, with respect. But to illustrate what we're talking about here, we heard about the numbers of MAP cases, and those are just the reported numbers, 2,300 up to 4,600. But they're just numbers. If you think about it in a more practical way, we are sitting in a room right now, and these are the MAP cases, and water is flowing in through the double tax cases. Well, right now there's water up to 5 feet, about 1.5 meters. So some of us have already, there's water over our heads. And some of the others, they're starting to feel the water rising. The water is flowing in. We don't have means to stop the water from flowing in. But everybody's got a mop. But the mops are all saturated. That's the MAP programs as they exist today. Now the discussion draft is giving us buckets. So everybody can grab a bucket and start pouring water out. And maybe we'll be able to stabilize the level of the water. But then there's BEPS. BEPS is a river that's about to be diverted into this room. You're laughing, but it's true. BEPS is a river. It's about to be diverted into this room. And the buckets are not going to be sufficient. What you need is an industrial strength water pump. It exists. It's been proven. It's the mandatory binding MAP arbitration. And we don't need it tomorrow. We need it now. The water is rising right now. If we don't do something about it pretty soon, some of us are going to get tired of swimming. We're going to hit the ceiling pretty soon, and we'll have nowhere to go in any event. So we need it now, and it needs to be at the forefront. Now, the Canada-US experience with binding arbitration has been mentioned. It's worth spending some time on it. Canada and the U.S. had one of the largest backlog of MAP cases. When the powers that be brought in mandatory binding arbitration, it changed not only the time to get the cases resolved, it actually guaranteed that the cases would get resolved, and all of that sort of turned the situation around. For those who've been reading the transfer pricing report for as long as I have, remember all the articles leading up to mandatory arbitration actually being put in place between Canada and the U.S. That relationship was just not working. Now, cases are working well between the two. Again, it needs to be back in the forefront here at the OECD. And in my view, and with respect, I agree with Manal. It's not enough to simply say we don't have consensus. The OECD should show leadership and say, look, guys, we do have a tool. It does work. Put it in the model convention, and those who disagree with it can put a reservation and say, well, we don't want to do it. Then you'll have the list of countries where you might end up with either double taxation or double taxation that takes a very long time to resolve. There's a cost to all that. I hope I'm not frightening anybody, but the water is rising. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you didn't think that I was laughing. At least I was just smiling with admiration at the ingenuity of your sustained metaphor. Barbara Angus.
Hello, I'm Jose Bustos from Ernst & Young. Well, I would like to make a few general remarks, and I kind of agree with the river theory that has been expressed here. I think that to us, this Action 14 is really critical for the success of all BEPS program. That's for sure. We have been said that maps have increased or have doubled in the last few years. But I think it's true, but it's also true that in some other cases, it could be even more cases if taxpayers would have felt that map works. So it's probably the river is coming, but I mean the river is even bigger than what we expect, because taxpayers think that the map as it is today is not working very well. And really the solution, and I agree with previous commentators, and I'm not going to repeat the arguments which I think are valid. The only real solution is arbitration. That's our impression, and that's for sure. So we again agree with those that have said that more time should be spent in order to provide an arbitration solution under this Action 14. As it is the only way really to go forward and to find a real solution. And if that means that the BEPS has to continue working on this after September 15, I think that deserves it. I mean, we cannot just think that because of the BEPS time limits we cannot have this kind of discussions. I agree that we have to have them anyway. We cannot skip this tremendous opportunity to really deal with this issue. I think that the draft paper should address that really seriously and try to find a solution. I mean, we all know there is no consensus, and that's something that we could all expect when we started to talk about arbitration. I fully agree with the comments that, well, maybe if we really have a thoughtful sharing of ideas between countries and between the stakeholders, we will really find what the problem is with sovereignty and the political reasons. There are intermediate ways which are not arbitration that may also could help, as mediation, that has also been said here. So I think that, and we also have good experience. We have talked about the Canada-US experience. We could share here in that dialogue that I think that we need to have. We also have the European Union Arbitration Convention. We all know that it hasn't worked, in my opinion, very well until now. But of course, we can learn from that. I mean, if we put on the table, I mean, what's the problems with the EU Arbitration Convention, we will learn on that. And we may be able here at the OECD to improve what we have already in the European Union, which is a great opportunity also to deal with that. So to me, I fully agree with the comments that arbitration is the only way to go forward. Also, I mean, moving apart from arbitration, and as a general comment, we've seen also in the draft report that there are many references to the manual on effectiveness of MAP, which we understand is a wonderful work of the OECD. It's been very helpful. But I think maybe the OECD, as it is recommended many of the best practices that are already there, could take a step forward and introduce what is in the manual into the commentaries of Article 25, because I think that will really improve the perception of countries on how important these best practices are. If we read the draft paper, many of them are already there. I mean, it's really nothing new. The options are there, but it's in the manual. Why don't we introduce that in the commentaries? I think that's something that could be also useful in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I can't see the name on your flag, but sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Christer Andersson. I'm the chairman of the tax policy group of Business Europe. And Business Europe represents, through its member federation, some 21 million businesses throughout Europe. To continue the metaphor, I think we are actually here to discuss the stream of jobs and investment. That's the purpose of the exercise here. And then Business Europe feels that the discussion draft could be more ambitious in the objective in making dispute resolution mechanisms more effective. Although the intentions behind the 34 proposed revisions to the Model Treaty are to be commended, the actual proposed revisions are too non-committal to truly address the obstacles preventing dispute resolution. We are concerned that due to the absence of a more direct language, the dispute resolution process going forward will not ensure reducing double taxation. And actually words like governments may or could, they need to be replaced by words like government should or maybe even must if we are to really address double taxation issues. We've learned during the past 2 days that there is some reluctance to maybe change discussion drafts in substance, but Business Europe will really strongly urge the Secretariat to work on the monitoring aspect of dispute resolution mechanism. I think there is really a need to form a forum and working groups where there is involvement from the business community to sit down together with governments to monitor and to address double taxation situations. We do that in a rather effective way already at the European level with the Joint Transfer Pricing Forum. We also sit together from the business community with government representatives in the Platform for Tax Good Governance. And we really recommend that the Secretariat pay a lot of efforts into getting effective fora for discussing and monitoring the developments in this area and to address how to resolve tax issues in an efficient way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to stick to the timetable, but I don't want to compress people's contributions. So what I suggest we do is we take a coffee break there, and then we'll resume immediately afterwards with Sol Picciotto. So let's take a coffee break and come back at 11:30, please. Right, shall we resume? Sol Picciotto, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm here as the coordinator of the BEPS monitoring group. I haven't quite got the boilerplate language that Will Morris has, or the ability probably to adapt it to different situations, but anyway, we're a network of about 35 now, independent researchers, academics, some retired like myself, and sponsored by a number of civil society organisations working on tax justice, but not kind of representing them. They generally support our aims, but not necessarily everything we say. And what we're trying to do is to put in an independent perspective on this whole BEPS process and possibly beyond. So there is considerable civil society interest in this question. In fact, I'm the only person possibly here from that broader perspective. Doesn't mean that there isn't that broader interest. Obviously, there are issues of resources and time and so on. So we're very appreciative of the opportunity to make some comments on this. And our comments in general don't disagree that much, I think, with a lot of those that have been expressed from a business point of view. What we would say first is that if you want to chart a path, you have to have a clear idea of the destination. Firstly, you need to design a dispute resolution mechanism in the context of the particular kinds of issues that you're going to have to deal with. But in any context, a dispute resolution mechanism could only really deal with a tiny minority of cases. The first point is that the system has to be robustly designed with rules that are easy to administer. And I think possibly some of the concern that quite a lot of people have expressed, anticipating that conflicts will arise, we share that concern because it does seem to us that in a number of areas, instead of getting clear and easily to administered rules, we're getting really some confusion in a number of areas, in particular possibly in the transfer pricing area. There's considerable rewriting of the guidelines on transfer pricing, and from our point of view, really, perhaps there hasn't been time, but the transfer pricing guidelines needed really a new approach. And what's happened is that there's been a kind of patch-up. So bits have been added to it, and it's kind of, grown into a kind of monster over the years, the guidelines. That's just really an illustration of the problem, that unless you can get clear and easy to administer rules, then the system will be problematic, and dispute resolution can't resolve that. By its nature, dispute resolution can only, in any field of society, can only deal with a tiny minority of cases. The rule system itself must be robust. That's the first point. Next, then, for those cases that do need, what should it look like? And we picked up from the discussion draft a mention of three criteria which we would support. It's mentioned, I think, in the context of what would a political commitment be to good faith implementation of treaties. And it should be principled, fair and objective. And we think we should discuss what is meant by principled, fair and objective and really amplify that and really put that forward clearly. Some of this was already said, I think, possibly from the ICC and others. A principled system, I think the word technical was used earlier in the discussion, but a principled system requires really that decisions should take the form of reasoned decisions. Reasons must be given for decisions based on an analysis of the facts of a case, the rules that are applicable, how they've been interpreted, and how they've been applied to the specific case. We're used to that. You need a reasoned decision. The system must be fair in that like cases should be treated alike. Now, from our point of view, a key aspect of that is that the decisions should be published, not only because there's no confidence that like cases have been treated alike unless the decisions are published, but for many other reasons. Publication of decisions enables a widespread and robust debate of those reasons. If the reasons are only disclosed to a closed network of participants, then others that are excluded from that network really aren't able to comment on whether they're going to be treated fairly or not. I'm sure many of you in your experience have had cases where you've only indirectly found out of what a MAP settlement has done to somebody else, possibly one of your competitors, and that has come as a surprise to you. Publication enables widespread discussion of those reasons and a robust discussion and development. I think the word jurisprudence wasn't quite used, but certainly a track record that everybody knows. And that knowledge helps to ensure that parties can resolve their disputes without necessarily resorting to the dispute resolution mechanism. So publication really should be regarded as central to fairness. Not only in the sense, as I say, that a wider public can know that it's fair, but really to contribute to a principled system. And then finally, an objective system. And again, this was mentioned by ICC, for example, that decision makers should be independent of the disputing parties, no vested interests or conflicts of interest, and the rules should be formulated so as to be easily applicable to specific cases. Now, if we try to state that, we can see how far the existing MAP procedure is from that. So if that's our destination, how do we get to that? And I think some of the experience in other fields, which again, I entirely agree with the ICC, needs to be looked at, can be instructive in this area. There are two major areas of international economic governance, if you like, which have gone in this direction of introducing adjudication systems, quasi-judicial adjudication systems in trade and international investment. And in the trade area, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, had a very similar provision in it to those in tax treaties, where if the parties were concerned about an interpretation issue, they should try and resolve it. So a very similar procedure. But the history of the GATT, if one looks at it, is that fairly early on within the GATT, a procedure was developed to facilitate that again, along the lines that the ICC kind of suggested, there are many ways in which you can move forward towards a principled, fair and objective system, and they set up a panel system where the panel would attempt to kind of mediate, but then issue the panel's reasoned decision, which wasn't then binding on the parties. But at least you had an independent mechanism, a principled decision which was put out there, and then parties didn't necessarily have to accept it, but obviously there was increasing pressure. And there was considerable experience of that over a couple of decades, I think, of the GATT. And it was only eventually within the World Trade Organization that they moved to then a much more formalized adjudication system, which people possibly know about, where you've now got a more formalized panel system and then also an appellate body. So it took them several decades on the basis of experience, but moving forward more on the way, to set up these kinds of independent adjudication systems first before suddenly saying mandatory binding. To jump to mandatory binding, unless you've got that building of confidence, unless you've got that building up of track record, the building up of jurisprudence, really is to put the cart before the horse. Now, we also entirely agree with business concerns that disputes have been gathering, and I think it's partly because of the gathering, the reasons behind the increase of disputes that has actually led to the BEPS process. But the outcomes of the BEPS process are going to take us all into uncharted waters. But again, I would say that reliance on the dispute resolution mechanism isn't the best way to deal with that. If you say, well, there are going to be problems of implementation and application of the BEPS reforms, absolutely. But what's needed for that is not an ad hoc individual dispute mechanism. What's needed is a proper follow-up mechanism which can monitor the implementation of the BEPS proposals, advise states, and maybe even comment on ways in which the reforms have been implemented in different states, improve coordination and improve understanding about the proposals. Now, there again, we would say that that kind of a process absolutely must not be behind closed doors. That a public debate about these issues and how the interpretation is carried out in different countries is going to be far better for everybody concerned. There is obviously perhaps a reluctance to envisage kind of a new world. But frankly, again, the experience in a number of other areas has been that it may feel comfortable if you're part of a group of people who kind of know each other, refer to each other by their first names, meet in IEFA congresses and so on. You know how things go and you can resolve things quietly. That's not the world we're now in. Now we've got a much more diverse world. You've got very many more countries now applying international tax rules. Transfer pricing rules have gone around the world. Every country is now going to apply those rules. And that is a world where a closed community deciding things behind closed doors is not going to resolve these issues adequately. We do need to devise robust institutions. So here I entirely agree with what's been said from the ICC. Let's look at the experience in other areas. Maybe we would disagree about the publication, views about publication, for instance, because I know that in the international investment area there's been more reluctance. But let's look at the experience of international investment arbitration. It can now, I think, fairly be described as being in crisis, largely because it hasn't been adequately institutionalized, certainly in comparison to the trade area. So proper institutionalization in a way that can really create a much more open debate. I mean, it's not going to be on the front page of every newspaper of the world, but it needs to be accessible, open debate about these issues of interpretation, which are going to be very important in a large number of countries. So let's design a proper mechanism. Let's not think it can substitute for a follow-up mechanism to ensure a proper implementation of the BEPS. And let's move towards that, but with a clear idea of the goal and not just jump straight or insist that we jump straight to mandatory binding arbitration, for which there's no basis of confidence, trust or understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is it Chasroy Chowdhury?
Andrew, thank you very much. While we're members of BEAC, I'm head of tax at ACCA, which is an accountancy, global accountancy body which we work in the public interest. So I think, taking Sol's point, we very much want to proceed on the BEPS project along lines which will be in the public good. So that's the angle we're coming from. And what I would say is that we, and I very much agree with people who have gone before, we need to have a system of mandatory binding arbitration. Because Sol mentioned about putting the cart before the horse, but I think a lot of the BEPS work is putting the cart before the horse, where we don't have proper precedents, we don't really know how some of these measures are going to work out. So we need to actually have a system where we then deal with disputes expeditiously, because I think our French colleague hit the nail on the head. A lot of these disputes are just not dealt with in any fast-track way. They'll go on for years, and we need to actually fast-track any disputes that happen. And there is going to be a tsunami of disputes which come in, and sorry for taking the river analogy a bit further. So we need to actually think about ways of dealing with those. And I think also where we have member states to bilateral committees which aren't necessarily acting in good faith. For example, taking the UK diverted profits tax, I just don't think that is giving a thumbs up to the BEPS project at all. It's just the opposite. And I think to deal with those kind of situations in a way that is fast-tracking problems that businesses have and tax authorities have, we need to look very much at a mandatory process which doesn't clog up the system, where businesses have certainty and we just don't have everybody running around thinking, where do we stand in the new world of BEPS once it's implemented in 2016? And it's really a part of the multilateral instrument. We should be looking to implement dispute resolution in a mandatory fashion under an impartial arbitration system. However that's set up, and I take very much on board some of Sol's points here, whether it should be out of the open, how the mechanism in terms of the people who arbitrate is set up, but we can take these issues offline and decide those among people who actually know and who have a vested interest or who are impartial to the debate, and let's decide. But we need to make sure we don't just soft pedal this idea of dealing with disputes. It's very much at the core of the BEPS project, and sorting out anything that comes out of the BEPS project and bringing order to the new order that BEPS is going to bring to the world stage.
Thank you, Roy. Is it Richard Sliman?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Richard Sliman. I'm a Managing Director of Conterra Global. We're a specialty transfer pricing firm. I want to echo the comments of Francois about the river, and I agree to the tsunami. I think it's without dispute that there will be a lot of disputes running out of the BEPS project. And I think I'm fully in favor of having a mandatory arbitrage clause included in the model. And at the same time, I also recognize that it may not be the moment in time that it will be feasible to get full consensus on mandatory arbitrage. And I'm a pragmatician. I'd like to get resolution. So my suggestion would be to actually, I think the majority of the countries, and I hope the majority of the countries, would second mandatory arbitrage. So I would suggest to get mandatory arbitrage to be the default position into, let's say, solving these issues. Next to the mandatory arbitrage, I have heard a lot of mentioning already about mediation as a second best option. I think mediation does not have the issue with sovereignty of countries. So there might be much more political consensus about accepting as the next best option mediation to agree. And I think it's essential that there is a consensus internationally about what the minimum standards would be. Minimum standards could be mediation. I would second a situation where we actually would include mediation as the first step after the usual MAP position. And only after mediation, which is a much more efficient, much more cost-efficient approach in trying to get a third-party involvement and perhaps persuading parties to get to a solution. And only after, for instance, a one-year mediation term, get to the more mandatory arbitration stage. And that's all about, let's say, the concept. And at the same time, I would like to make the remark that in experience, I think, and it has been mentioned before, that most of the maps that have been processed actually resolve in solutions. it's about 10 to 5% of the MAPs that actually would benefit from arbitrage. And that's not totally correct, because arbitrage has a bit of an indirect effort on the whole process, because it's the stick behind the door to get parties moving. But at the same time, if you look at that percentage, 90% of the MAPs processed are being resolved. And we know that tsunami is coming. MAPs are going to be put forward in huge amounts. I would like to be pragmatic in a way that what makes most effort, what makes the most, let's say, efficient approach, to me, that is all about resources. We can discuss about theoretics and about concepts about we should have mandatory arbitrage in there. Yes, and I fully support that. But at the same time, I would make a firm stand. I would hope that the countries would address that. The full commitment in taking BEPS and the dispute resolution to a success is putting sufficient resources in place. Because if there is a 10,000 MAPs coming in on a yearly basis because of the new order, I'd rather have 90% of those 10,000 being resolved because we have the resources to address it and process it and get to a solution than just focusing on the theoretical and the conceptual argument about it should be mandatory arbitrage. I think everybody, both tax authorities and business, is mostly benefiting from getting to a solution. And for me, the true commitment of the whole BEPS program and the dispute resolution is about getting sufficient resources in place. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it Manal Corwin? Yeah, please.
I just wanted to pick up on some of the comments Saul made with regard to jumping to mandatory binding arbitration as putting the cart before the horse, and the reference to the need to have the development of jurisprudence over time to get the confidence of arbitration as a adequate dispute resolution mechanism. I think it highlights some of the need, again, to get together and parse through the language and what is, what happens, or the model for mandatory binding arbitration versus other models of arbitration. And those conversations are longer conversations, but the concern about the development of jurisprudence and so forth is one of the concerns that a number of countries point to as a concern about going to arbitration, because of the fact that the belief is that a treaty, by its nature and the terms of that treaty, is the jurisprudence that's relevant to the resolution of a dispute, and that the commentary that supports the treaty between the two domestic countries that are the treaty partners inform that, and the OECD standards inform that as well. But every contract may be slightly different within the parameters of that scope, and the idea of a dispute resolution is to determine what was the agreement between those parties, interpret that, and resolve it. And when there's a conflict and they are at loggerheads, having a dispute resolution mechanism that resolves that without developing new law is what the goal is, and helps to address some of the concerns about sovereignty. To the extent the resolution of multiple disputes ends up, moving in a direction, because in mandatory arbitration, you need to have each party submit a position paper, only one of which can be picked. The arbitration panel is not permitted to interpret the law any differently than either of the countries do. They just need to pick the most reasonable of the two submitted papers. The countries then have an opportunity, based on the outcomes of those arbitrations, if in fact they even get to arbitration, because the idea is it actually creates an incentive for them to resolve disputes before they get to arbitration. But if there's a pattern of outcomes, they can then choose to come back to the table and renegotiate and change the jurisprudence. And in fact, they have the incentive to do that if they don't like those outcomes. So I think that the idea is to leave the making of the contract and the law and the development of the law between the contracting states who negotiate the terms in the first place, but figure out a way to make sure that disagreements about how to interpret the deal that they cut when they went to the table don't go on forever for the purpose of the taxpayer. And just a brief word on the publication so that there's fairness and so forth. I mean, I think, again, it's linked to this concept of, are you developing jurisprudence and treating everybody equally in different cases? These cases are typically not situations where you're adjudicating the tax liability of the taxpayers that's in the middle. You're trying to, it's a conflict between countries, not between the taxpayer and the country per se. The taxpayer is impacted and just wants to be able to know which country to, the country to whom they owe the tax. So how the countries resolve that, it seems to me it's not necessarily clear that they would have an incentive to resolve that differently in the case of every taxpayer, because again, it's about how they want to interpret the deal between themselves. But anyway, I think these are longer debates and technical ones, and we can compare different kinds of arbitration and what they do, but I do think it's an important conversation to have, and one that I very much welcome having with all the business interests and public interests at the table with the governments that have the biggest concerns around what arbitration means for them.
Thank you, Manel. Thomas Rosser, is it?
Hi, my name is Tom Rosser. I'm with Microsoft. I want to say at the beginning, thank you very much for holding this important consultation. I think a lot of the options in the paper were very positive. Hopefully, a lot of the coulds will be changed to shall or must, as previously mentioned. From a taxpayer perspective, we're going to, business will comply with the tax laws wherever they may be. We need predictable and clear tax rules, and we think one of the most important things missing from this is mandatory binding arbitration. Not because as a taxpayer will ever be subject to it, hopefully would never be, none of our countries would be party to that, but it does drive for resolution. So I just want to echo the comments made around the table that would be very important to do that. We also believe that the competent authorities should be independent and adequately funded so they can do their job. I think business has already seen increased number of disputes between countries around the world already, and with the BEPS effort, we think that will probably increase. So once again, we think mandatory binding arbitration would be very important, and we also think it would be important to have the OECD publish statistics on each country on their MAP efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol Donahue, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to first express appreciation for Professor Picciotto's support, generally speaking, of arbitration. Manal Corwin has already covered a couple of points. I do think that there is a fine balance to be struck in making sure that a process is designed so that it is acceptable to as many countries as possible and operates as efficiently as possible so it doesn't create an unnecessary drain on government resources. And that's the reason that we designed the U.S. Approach the way that it operates. So just to clarify that point, I did want to comment briefly on two other comments. The suggestion has been made that mediation should be the first stop, have a year of mediation first, and while there are all sorts of approaches that could be taken, I myself am skeptical of the value of mediation. The MAP cases that I have seen over the years that have gotten stuck for an extended period of time are not the sorts of cases that really could have been resolved through mediation. They are cases where both contracting states have very firm and established views and are not willing to compromise them. And so my suspicion is that a mediation, a mandatory mediation process, as it were, would do more to benefit the mediators than anyone else. I wanted to comment on the discussion of commercial arbitration as a model. I certainly think all options here are worth considering, I do think that that commercial arbitration, full-fledged arbitration of the type that we've been discussing this morning, tends to raise concerns when it was discussed in the UN Tax Committee. There were concerns raised by a lot of countries that it would be too expensive, and a lot of countries expressed the view that they had themselves some negative experiences with commercial arbitration. And so the decision at the UN, in which a number of people here were involved, was to include as an alternative in the UN model something that looks more like a last offer approach in order to streamline things. So that's why we had suggested that. But again, this is important work, and I think it makes sense for the working group and for interested stakeholders to continue to look at all the options.
Alison Lobb.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Alison Lobb from Deloitte. I wondered if I could ask a question. We've been very clear, I think, on the fact that mandatory binding arbitration provides, in the end, a solution and resolution, and it also has an important deterrent effect in encouraging the MAP process to get to agreement before it's necessarily needed. But also, as a pragmatist, if we're looking for a route through from where we are now to getting to that perhaps perfect answer, one of the comments in the paper, and it was mentioned this morning in the opening remarks from the chair of the focus group, is that some countries who have an issue around sovereignty might be prepared to agree to binding arbitration in relation to some articles of the treaty. And I wondered if it was possible to get some clarity on which articles those countries are prepared to accept mandatory binding arbitration in respect of. Thank you.
I certainly can't give you that answer from the chair. If any country wants to have a go, then they're welcome to do so, but I'm not sure we're really at that stage yet.
Well, just on that, you can actually look at treaties that have been concluded and see that some of these treaties restrict the scope of arbitration to some disputes. I think I remember that Article 9, Article 5 are the kind of articles that would be normally subject to disputes, but others, it varies from treaty to treaty. So that could give you the position of the various countries. But I think, as was made clear, this is the view that some countries might take. So that's where I would leave it. Just following, maybe while I have the floor, on Carol's comment, that is something that I think is probably correct on mediation. And a lot of people have made comments on the need for binding arbitration, and I would certainly not say anything negative on that. I personally have my views, and a lot of people know that I was involved in the development of the provision that is in the OECD model on arbitration. It's just a question of convincing people to adopt the provision. But generally on mediation and all the comments about changing the rules on arbitration, I'm not sure that's really where we need to focus, because I think the rules as they are in the model are pretty robust. It's just a question of people not adopting them. Maybe the only reserve that I would have is that we offer the possibility of countries to either choose on a case-by-case basis between reasoned opinion or last best offer. Maybe the tendency now would be to reverse that if I were to look at what people are doing in their treaties. But that's just a matter of choice between the two countries. The last best offer, of course, is probably a lot cheaper, but also a lot faster. People who are considering adding another step of mediation would need to take that into account. Mediation was referred to in the 1977 model. It was mentioned that you could refer a matter to the Committee on Fiscal Affairs if you had an issue. I don't think it was ever taken upon by any country to try to do that. Frankly, if you've negotiated within a mutual agreement procedure for some time, I guess you have a pretty clear idea of what prevents you from solving the dispute, and it might be good to have a decision made by someone else on that. You don't need a reasoned opinion. The reality is, and I don't think that was said this morning, but that's always been said by people who talk about arbitration. We need arbitration not to have arbitration cases, to make sure that people solve the map within the map, and it doesn't go to arbitration.
Thank you, Jacques. Mary Bennett, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wanted perhaps to echo a bit of what Jacques has just said. I mean, we went together through the exercise some years ago of working on the arbitration provision that is in the OECD model. And, you know, it certainly was of interest to hear the different points that were raised this morning about whether you need to have reasoned decisions versus last best offer, whether you need to have published decisions versus ones that are private to the taxpayers and the countries involved, whether you need to have mediation first or not. I haven't heard anything new this morning that wasn't discussed at this same location in some detail 8-9 years ago that brought forward the provision that we have that has now been picked up in a number of treaties, not as many as one had hoped at that time. The ones where it has been picked up, we've had only a few years of experience, but those years have indicated very positive effects on getting cases resolved, not, as Jacques says, through having them go through arbitration, but having perhaps a handful of them go through arbitration and the majority of others move much more quickly towards resolution before they get there. I was disappointed personally, having gone through that exercise, that the paper that came out didn't reflect more of the discussion of those issues, how they had been covered in the past, and what the thinking was, what the work revealed that had been done, and then addressing head-on what further thoughts either existing or new players would bring to that discussion. In the meantime, that is work that absolutely should be done, has to be done. If you do look at the statistics, I think you will see that the caseload, the inventory of cases has doubled in the 7 years from 2006 to 2013. If you look at the rate of, already at the rate of increase of incoming cases over resolved cases each year, it's going up at a rate where currently the caseload inventory will double in the next 3 years. That's without BEPS having come yet. And we hear everybody saying that that's going to have a tremendous new increase even in that rate of incoming cases, which I think is undeniable. In terms of political commitment, it is good to hear that there is political commitment. One would like to see that reflected in something more than words on an OECD paper. If one saw that the countries that have made that political commitment have said, oh my God, look, we have doubled our caseload in the last 7 years, let's double our resources today to deal with those. Let's make a commitment to double our resources again within the next 3 years to deal with what's coming. If I picked up the newspaper and saw that statement in the news, in the tax press, rather than the statement that this country or that country has targeted to increase its audits of multinationals, you know, way over what has been going on in the past, and is looking to bring more and more new cases, that's the political commitment I see. I don't see in real terms a political commitment to deal with the disputes that are going to come out of this. And you know, that I think is something that is very worrying to see. I think once we get off of arbitration, we're going to be talking about very important other aspects of improving MAP, and those are super important. And I agree completely with Saul that dispute resolution can't be the be-all and end-all. There aren't that many cases that you can deal with through MAP, but the process does have to be effective for the cases that it deals with. And if one looks at the experience under the EU arbitration, just as an example, we know that there were failures with that. We discussed those failures 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago right here and made an effort to address them by having aspects of the OECD version that would avoid the deadlock. If you look at the statistics that have come out on the EU arbitration, and you see that there are hundreds of cases that have gone beyond the 2-year limit for triggering arbitration, and yet we have single digits of actual arbitration. It is indicative, I think, of something going on that indicates that there's not commitment at some level to live up to the obligations to resolve cases. If you read some of the footnotes of why those cases are still lingering after 2 years, you will find some very interesting things. For example, cases lingering because a state has not managed to get an initial position paper out after 2 years. That does not reflect a commitment to deal with MAP. So I'm happy to hear about political commitment, but I think we need to see something more substantial. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Sol Picciotto.
Thank you, Chair. I think some of the points made about the reasons why states often are reluctant to move to this kind of an independent adjudication system are absolutely valid, of course. Governments are kind of reluctant to have a jurisprudence build up, and they feel that they want to control the text. They understand what the treaty rules mean, and to have an independent adjudicator interpret they consider is a breach of sovereignty. But I mean, that's one of the major obstacles to them accepting mandatory binding arbitration under the present model of secrecy. Again, if we look at the experience in other fields, and I think we do have to do that. It's fine to say we've had a lot of these discussions in the UN committee 10 years ago. We decided this, we decided that. But all the things that people are saying now about the growth of cases and the inability of the existing system to deal with it seems to suggest that maybe the solutions adopted 10 years ago were not entirely suitable. 10 years ago, in fact, I and I think one or two other academics, the late Michael McIntyre in particular, did send written submissions suggesting that we look at the experience at that time of GATT and consider publication. I don't know if anybody involved in those discussions even read our submissions. We were probably considered to be way out in left field. So I think that, again, you know, you're a relatively small group of people who know each other, but we are in a new world now. We're not talking about disputes between US and Canada. Okay, US and Canada, wonderful. But we're talking about possible disputes between Kenya and Singapore. You know, it's a new world where you do have to look a little bit outside the box, and I think looking at the experience of these other areas can be quite instructive. I'm not saying that you would adopt the same model at all. Tax obviously raises different issues from trade issues. But nevertheless, there are some significant similarities. And the way that the GATT moved towards the WTO adjudication model, as I said, was over a number of decades, not just years, where then there was a track record of decisions being, panel reports being published and then not necessarily being binding. And it was on the back of that that states eventually did accept a system which is basically an adjudication system, which still there are complaints about. Certainly regularly the dispute settlement body of the WTO regularly says, well, you're not supposed to be even interpreting the rules. They say you're supposed to apply the rules, not interpret them, but everyone knows there's always interpretation involved. But nevertheless, there's a good track record of WTO appellate body decisions being implemented. However uncomfortable states have found those decisions, I don't think there's a case where they haven't been implemented in the end. So you do need to look at those other experiences, design a model that is robust for the future. And again, I would come back to the point, the tsunami of cases. If you say, well, we need to separate out the fast track and routine cases to ones that raise, well, that's an interesting point. If what one anticipates is that the BEPS reforms might raise questions of interpretation that are broader and raise more difficult decisions, then those shouldn't be for a dispute settlement procedure. Those should be for a follow-up mechanism where they can be discussed in more general terms rather than in relation to any specific disputes. You may well get a number of different disputes that all raise the same point. Well, the most efficient way of dealing with those isn't through ad hoc individual disputes resolution mechanism, but through a broader institutional body that can look at the principles behind those various decisions and issue some kind of interpretation. So I think we do have to think a bit outside the box, design something more appropriate to this rather different world the tax is moving into. And again, not put the cart before the horse, not to say, I mean, until I mentioned the word publication, nobody else discussed it. Mandatory binding, but why not publishing?
Thank you. Before I bring in Kathy Schultz, can I ask Marlies de Ruyter if she's got a comment?
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I was thinking as Jacques and Mary kind of being involved in the previous dispute resolution process had already said something, I may as well add. If you look at, I think, what we did in 2007 and 2008, I fully agree with what Jacques said before. The question is, you know, the guidance that we did then, was it relevant? Yes. Was it good guidance? Yes. And probably, you know, if implemented properly, it would have gotten us a very, very long way, if not all the way, to improving dispute resolution to a level where you would be confident that it worked, where you would find it a mechanism that provides certainty and predictability. So I think our assessment is that, and that's our personal assessment also, is that, you know, the rules are pretty okay, and of course improvements are always possible. You can always improve the rules, but it's also that, you know, paper is only paper, and it's about people implementing the paper, and that's something that kind of happened to me on every panel that I was on dispute resolution. It seems like kind of the panel discussions have been the same years and years in a row, that we were saying, yes, but still it's not working. I think that a very good thing that came out of the process that we had in 2007, 2008 were the statistics. Because now at least we have some information on how we're doing on dispute resolution, and many have already referred to it. And the question is, do these statistics give us a complete picture? They give us an interesting picture, but do they give us a complete picture of how we're doing in MAP and how we're doing on implementation of tax treaties? And if we answer that question in an honest way, probably the answer is no. It gives us a very interesting picture, but it doesn't give a complete picture of, you know, how we are handling dispute resolution as countries. Because, for example, it doesn't give a picture about access to MAP. You know, is access to MAP always provided for when needed? Are the processes of actually asking for a MAP, are these clear and always accessible to countries? Do countries actually have someone to receive a MAP request? Is there somewhere in the administration receiving a MAP request? And you know, I have talked to delegates from emerging and developing economies saying, well, I'm the only person there. And I also do all the OECD work or all the other work. So I agree that actually there's also something missing in the statistics that we have. It gives an interesting picture. And one interesting element that I would like to flag up is if you look at the statistics, one of the interesting elements is to look at the difference between a small number of countries having very big caseloads and a very large number of countries having very relative low numbers of caseloads. That may not kind of indicate that the issues in each of these countries are in the countries with the low caseloads are less. That doesn't indicate it. Maybe kind of the countries with the bigger caseloads have better MEP processes than the ones with the lower caseloads. What it does indicate probably is that the solutions to be implemented by these countries may be different. There may be different solutions and different emphasis in the solutions. And I think that's something relevant that we need to take into account. A point that I would also like to kind of agree to was the point made by Sol, the BEPS monitoring group, several times, is that, of course, we need to look at dispute resolution in the context of all of the administrative processes of implementing international tax rules. It's not, the rules need to be clear, they need to be implemented properly, and then as a kind of the closing part of that process, there needs to be a dispute resolution process that works. And if we have mandatory and binding arbitration in the end, I agree that there may be a sanitizing effect on all the other elements of the process. So I think those were the things that I wanted to flag up and that I think are reflected in what we try to say in the discussion draft. Mary made the point that she didn't see the political commitment, and I think it's fair to say that if you look at the current situation, that we recognize that there can be relevant improvements made, that these relevant improvements are in the fact of moving from paper reality to practical reality of implementation of a lot of the guidance. And I think I value very much your comments in saying what kind of mandatory and binding arbitration could bring to that process. I also value very much the support I heard this morning for both kind of people committing to concrete points of improving their processes, and the value that would be brought by a monitoring process to make sure that kind of paper reality becomes practical reality. So I think that's what I wanted to say, and because I heard also a couple of people say, but still also in the guidance, in what is actually in there as of rules, there are improvements possible. I think, and that's also hopefully a discussion that we will have a bit of today. And that is exactly what we also would like to hear and wanted to ask your opinion on in the discussion draft. Because there, I think what we try to do is come up with some of the areas where we still think that improvements are possible if we're thinking about a standard to be set. And your opinions will be very highly when we get into these subjects. So that's what I wanted to add to what Jacques and Mary said. And I would also like to thank you at this stage already for kind of your comments made until now.
Thank you, Marlies. Then Kathy Schultz, please.
Thank you. I'm Kathy Schultz with the National Foreign Trade Council, and we have been in the forefront in the U.S. particularly of pushing very hard to have mandatory arbitration added to as many of our tax treaties as possible. The U.S.-Canada treaty has been brought up several times, but it's not the only treaty that the U.S. has that has mandatory arbitration in it. And a big part of that is not just, as we talked about before, to have this as a backstop to make sure that these cases never actually get to arbitration. But in some cases, it's just to get to the competent authorities to the table to talk to each other. In some cases, just getting two competent authorities together has been difficult in the past, and we've had trouble making sure that they can actually start to have this discussion. By having the arbitration, you have a backstop and you have a reason for these two people to have to get together to help try to resolve these cases. And it's been very effective. I mean, we've had a lot of discussion about the Canadian treaty, and that's worked very well for us. And I do want to have just respond to the BEPS monitoring group's discussion about publishing the outcome of these cases. A lot of these cases are transfer pricing cases, and the information that's included in them is proprietary information. Having that published and having that out there would have a chilling effect on arbitration, and a lot of companies, if they know that they go to arbitration, that their documentation and their pricing is going to be published, is going to make it less likely the companies are going to be willing to enter into the MAP process. So I think that having them published is not only not a good idea, I think it could have a chilling effect on the entire process. Thank you.
Thank you. Francois Vincent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to react to a couple of things. Part of the reason why we bring up the Canada-US mandatory arbitration is because it is perhaps the very first real-life example that we have of the work that was done in 2007, 2008. And while I can appreciate, you can shake your head, but I can still appreciate that you need confidence, we do have real data. We do have observation as to how parties actually behave once mandatory binding arbitration is put in play. And we know that exactly what Jacques was saying is supposed to happen did happen, and that is the vast majority of cases get resolved before the 2-year mark. How do we know that? Well, we saw it happen. There was a large backlog of cases that were beyond the 2-year mark, and most of them actually got resolved before the drop-dead date when mandatory arbitration kicked in. Mike Danilak's here, and I don't want to bait him into jumping in the fray, but here it did work, and what we saw subsequently to that, and some people were referring to the theory, the games theory, that's what we actually saw happening. The two parties went and had very few cases actually get to arbitration, and then they changed their way of negotiating the cases, and they ensured that, well, they tried to ensure that arbitration would never occur again, and that is the key. Nobody here really wants the cases to make it to arbitration, but the only way to ensure that they will get resolved, and they will get resolved on a timely basis, it seems to me, is mandatory binding arbitration. I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We do have the data, we do have the experience, and for those who are uncomfortable or don't have the confidence or the understanding, maybe what we need is a meeting where we sit down and either you do it in private with just the OECD member countries, and you have those countries who have the experience to talk about it, or there's a number of advisors who are former competent authority and others who do have the experience, who are more than willing to share in their experience with mandatory binding arbitration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jose Antonio Bustos, was it? Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'll be brief because I was going to raise exactly the same point that Francois just raised, and I fully agree with that comment and what Jacques Sasseville said before, that we really, I mean, one important thing of arbitration is that we want arbitration not to have arbitration, and there is evidence that when there is arbitration, many cases, and countries don't want the arbitration, so they care that not many cases go for that, and taxpayers don't like that also, because they rather have them solved by tax authorities. So we will all be so happy if that occurs, and there is evidence that that may occur if we have arbitration in the treaties. And for that reason, I think that, and coming back also to the point of the political commitment, and how important it is, and probably it's and it's true that this debate about arbitration has been here for many years already, 10, 12, and many of the ideas have already been raised before because they have been there for many years already. And what we need is more political commitment. Then what I think is that maybe if we look at how the draft report is now drafted, maybe we are losing here an opportunity to push on that political commitment, because if you look at the document as it's drafted today, it's to us it's not so firm in looking for arbitration, and that may be seen by countries that the OECD or this BEPS group is not really willing to go that path. And that's something that we should be careful not to have, because I think it is important, and it's a good opportunity here with this BEPS project to have the better political commitment that we can reach for all countries. And this kind of documents and the work that Action 14 is doing will probably help very much to have that commitment from other countries. So I think it's important to strengthen the wording in the document so as to look for an arbitration solution, because that will probably have the political commitment that we all want. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol Doran-Klein, please.
I want to actually respond to the GATS points, which in a prior life I worked on those issues, and I think the GATS is a special case. I mean, we do have a multilateral instrument that covers the majority of the world, and most of the commitments are not complex issues like we have in tax treaties. They relate to non-discrimination, either national treatment or most favored nation treatment. And so that's not to say that the issues aren't difficult to decide, but you do need the formal mechanism more in a context where you have the multilateral worldwide agreement. And as Manel pointed out previously, if what you're trying to decide is what the bilateral relationship is, then that formal mechanism that creates global jurisprudence is not really appropriate. Since I was wearing a government hat when I was working on this, I think the likelihood that the U.S. and the U.S. worked very hard to carve tax out, precisely because they wanted the tax in the map. They did not want the tax rules subject to the trade procedures. And so the history of the GATS is not compatible with adopting GATT principles for MAP. That's not to say that we disagree with mandatory binding arbitration. We support that, but I don't think that the GATS is necessarily the right path to go there.
Thank you, Carol. Henry Louis, the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Well, just to remind everybody of where we are, WP1 is facing the fact that there are a number of countries who are uncomfortable with arbitration. They have concerns about it. And I think we have heard today from business that there is a great interest in it. And I would hope that nothing that has been said today would be inadvertently maybe increasing concerns that some countries might have. For instance, I have heard a number of suggestions this morning about how the various forms of arbitration could be. For instance, references or suggestions for an expedited access to arbitration, suggestions about precedential application of prior decisions of arbitration, ideas about an institutional arbitration or commercial arbitration, or a quote third party stepping in to resolve an issue. I have heard references to a quasi judicial approach. And I wanted to say that my country is probably one of the most pro-arbitration ones at the OECD, and yet a lot of those things that I have just listed would be very concerning to the United States, and I think we would not even agree to it because, you know, we ourselves had sovereignty issues when we were developing that. So I just wanted to raise that, and I think Ms. Corwin's suggestion earlier that perhaps we are using the term arbitration a little bit too casually, and what needs to happen is a more in-depth study of, you know, the various types and what are the pros and cons. Do the various types address or exacerbate concerns that the member countries have?
Thank you, Henry. Philippe Thiria.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a small remark after a point raised by Jacques Cesville on the effect of pressure effect of arbitration on the MAP, on the preceding phases of MAP. I totally agree with that, and a lot of tax administration agree with that, and they confess that it has this effect. But we must be sure that it works effectively, which means that you must have a timetable, a strict timetable, which compels the tax authority to build up the arbitral body, the arbitration body, or the arbitration commission, and so on. And we know that in the treaty, in the European treaty, there is a gap here. The tax authority, the taxpayer can ask for arbitration, but there is no time limit to build up the arbitration commission. And sometimes tax authority have a problem to build up this commission or to design the arbiter. So we have a second rule to be written down, and which is if they cannot agree on arbiter, something must happen. For instance, OECD or any international body can help them and or give them some arbiters. And those two rules, the timetable and the possibility to have arbiter anyway being named, must be written down in the treaty and not in the commentary. This is what we think. Thank you.
Thank you. Susanna Bokobo, please.
Hello, good morning. I'm Susanna Bokobo from Repsol. The only thing I want to say is that businesses need a quick and efficient procedure to resolve conflicts or tax conflicts. So if arbitration is working, arbitration is the way to do the things. If MAP is working, the thing is that it's not working now as good as we want to. Well, try to improve it. But the thing is that the important thing is to move from paper to reality. And I say that because I was, before having this position in Repsol, I was the head of tax litigation in Repsol. And it was really, really, really frustrating just to see how the conflicts were for years and years and years without a solution. And that is very important because businesses have to work day by day and have to move all these the resources, all the money that it is stuck because of the conflicts, and that is the important things to achieve a quick and efficient and the best solution that is possible. And I do really know that we businesses and tax authority are going to commit in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Sol Pichot.
Thanks again, Mr. Chair. I mean, I do think that one does have to reflect on experience, but a wider range of experience than maybe many of the people in the room here. I'm sure that the comments from Fidel are straight from the heart and based on solid experience. But frankly, I don't think you can roll out the experience of the US-Canada model for the whole world in the new context that we're in. I think that has to be fanciful. One of the reasons I shook my head was it isn't the only experience. We have a binding arbitral convention within Europe. Now, I don't know very much about how that's worked in practice because it's kept confidential. Maybe some of you have more experience. As I understand it, rather few cases referred to it. Maybe that's as a result of the kind of deterrent effect. I don't know. But even within Europe, both the US, Canada, and Europe are rather different contexts. One could envisage, for example, regional agreements. You could envisage, for instance, within the East African Community, that countries there, where the East African Community Treaty actually includes a commitment to harmonization of taxation, they might be willing or interested to move towards a more binding dispute settlement if they should need it. But again, what I'm trying to point to is that the problems that have been experienced, and the problems that have been experienced are where you have very different cultural practices, very different understandings. Possibly you have to look at the reasons why there are some very significant states not willing to go along. And for people who have the experience, I'm sure the US-Canada has worked very well, but having got that experience to then want to roll that out for the rest of the world and say, this is the gold standard, and unless you accept it, somehow you're a deviant, isn't going to work, is it? You do need to look at the longer experience, and I do think that the longer history does need to be looked at. I think the ICC comments were valid. They began to reflect on the business experience, and ICC is absolutely right to say that they were the originators of the idea. So the business concerns to have a binding dispute settlement actually do go back to that early period of development of the tax treaty rules. And ICC asked for that in 1935 when Article 9 was put into the tax treaties. So it's absolutely nothing new. It has been asked for repeatedly by business. And one has to ask, why have states been reluctant to do it, and how can we, if you want it, how do you move towards it? And again, I do think the GATT experience, I'm glad to have the comments from Carol Klein. I think we would disagree on that. The GATT was a multilateralization of bilateral agreements, and the concerns, the kinds of disputes that emerged in the early days in the 50s and 60s were really as much bilateral issues about interpretation of commitments between individual states, the commitments that they made, the trade commitments that they made. And it built up over a long period of time the kind of confidence and understanding of the nature of the rules. Countries are, Henry Louis is absolutely right, of course, governments are very reluctant to move in this direction, but the experience in recent years has been that where there has been a rapid push towards an arbitration type system, as in investment arbitration, that's where the bigger concerns have arisen. As I say, in the investment arbitration area, it's fair to say there is a crisis. UNCTAD is organizing a meeting this year to discuss how to better institutionalize investment arbitration, precisely because of state concerns that its ad hoc nature, inadequate institutionalization has led to a crisis. So we do need to learn from the lessons of history in a wider way than just our own particular experiences in particular specific contexts, and ask for the underlying reasons and build slowly towards that, and not clutch at mandatory binding arbitration as the way to resolve the inevitable teething problems, or much more than teething. Maybe it's a tsunami. I don't know if I'm changing the metaphor wrongly there, but I'm sure there will be a lot of issues about implementation of BEPS, but really looking to mandatory binding arbitration to resolve those implementation questions just has to be wrong.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few more comments, a few more people who've indicated they'd like to speak. It would be quite nice to fit people in before lunch. If I can urge people to be fairly brief and not to repeat comments they've made before. This isn't really a debate. We're just trying to get new ideas out onto the table. Tim MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am the head of tax at Procter & Gamble. I'm speaking mainly as a practitioner of 30-plus years. I've, in my prior life, done transfer pricing at Deloitte, and I, for the last 16 years, have headed 2 multinationals tax functions with a lot of global reach. Inherently, that means you're confronting transfer pricing regularly, and that's the main experience I have with MAP. What I would suggest is, as part of BEPS, and this is to focus back where we started with Will Morris's opening comment, BEPS is introducing a lot of new rules, and the burden it's going to create and the unpredictability it's going to create changes the paradigm and the need for a better map. It really is not practical to say, well, let's see what happens, or let's wait a decade and let people warm up to this. We will drown by then. The practitioners who've done transfer pricing know that transaction methods are difficult enough cases for MAP. But at least you have some anchors. You have some facts that you can tie to. The analogies are a little more concrete. When we now lower the threshold for PE, we recharacterize risk allocations and profits. We are putting ourselves into a world of profit split for most of the disputes that are now in the future. If you've not done a profit split case, they're very different. There are very few anchors. What happens in practice, and these are difficult cases, is each side picks the facts they really like, and those are the ones that are the profit attractors, the magnets for the profit. And it's very susceptible to impasse. It elevates the need for this dispute mechanism enhancement. We are not where we were 2 years ago in this new world of BEPS. Many of the cases will be unresolvable, and I've already experienced multiple G20 countries arguing 100% force of attraction. And to help my management understand that dilemma, I said, well, if there's 3 of them, essentially the 3 governments collectively will confiscate all of our profits. So we do need a mechanism as part of this new world. I accept the rules are changing in BEPS. I accept there were problems with our current system that need fixing. But as part of that new world, we also have to have a complementary thing that fulfills OECD's classic mission. You've done a wonderful job for decades of bringing order and predictability to what is inherently potentially a chaotic debate about tax jurisdiction. With the introduction of these 14 other action steps, it is absolutely critical that you have a dramatically enhanced MAP procedure, because the burden is going to get much higher. I think my recommendation is the mutual implementation document should have as part of it a take it all or nothing, and what is called baseball arbitration, or probably more accurately last best offer. I wouldn't name it after a sport thing like cricket, so I wouldn't know what that means. So, but shorthand, the last best offer arbitration has a lot of virtues. The coalition of the willing within the G20 should adopt that as the standard. Those that have reservations may join it later, may warm up to it later, but the workload and the chaos that these other changes can potentially introduce are dramatic. In the extreme, and God help us, I hope it doesn't occur, but double taxation is a trade barrier. And if there's enough trade barrier cases, you get retaliation behavior. That's terrible for the global economy. That's terrible for individuals' standard of living and for the companies and the governments. We do need a new solution that's more enhanced. And I think the last best offer as part of the mutual implementation procedure is a strong recommendation I would provide.
Thank you. Carol Donahue, please.
I'm not sure I can top the eloquence of Tim's remarks, but you hear it now straight from businesses. I wanted to just respond quickly to a point that was made earlier. I don't think anybody is trying to foist a U.S.-Canada experience on anybody else. I don't think that experience is unique. If one reads our comments, one will see that it's being cited simply because the statistics that demonstrate the effect are published. It's the only instance of that I know, but we've got in the U.S. alone 4 other treaties with very similar provisions that haven't resulted in any arbitrations that anyone has heard about yet. And so I think more to the point, when the UN spent several years working on dispute resolution, just recently, 3 or 4 years ago, it reached the same conclusion. The arbitration option that is included in the UN model convention and commentary now is very similar to the provisions that have been proven effective in the models that we have been talking about, the actual bilateral treaties. Obviously, it's something for each set of treaty negotiators to work out. They can agree on whatever they like. The UN, the OECD did a lot of work recently about that and has left, I think, broad latitude for that. And so I don't think it's accurate to say that this is a limited perspective or a limited experience. The people who were working on devising those procedures were people who have actually had to deal with these controversies and who know what the impediments are. The only people that I've heard arguing for published reasoned positions to create a global body of jurisprudence are professors. And I take it that would be very interesting, but I don't think it's feasible and I don't think it's necessary.
Thank you, Carol. Peter Steeds, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Peter Steeds from KPMG in London, but only recently arrived from the UK Tax Administration, where I worked competent authority for a pretty long time. I worked my first MAP case, I think, in 1997, and my last one in 2014. And it's interesting, over that period of time, there's been very little change in the process. And what we have now, and what we need to do now, is to really make a step change in the way in which MAP works so that we can deliver this piece of the agenda. If you look at the rest of the BEPS programme, we're going to see some very radical changes to the way in which the international tax rules work, and those changes are arriving very soon. I think it's disappointing that the paper isn't perhaps more ambitious in the change which can be made, because this opportunity won't come again very soon. So listening to the debate, I think that the piece which has struck the strongest chord with me is actually how we get the political commitment from participating governments to bring it off the paper and make it real. And I'd very much like to see and to hear more about how that's going to be delivered, because without that change, I think a lot of the rest of the proposals that are in the paper will make the practical reality of how dispute resolution works pretty much the same as it was when I did that first case back in 1997. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Francois Vincent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to react just quickly at one point, why do we need this new tool now? And I think the reason why is, if you ask the practitioners who have the experience, who are involved, the companies and the advisors who are currently involved in the MAP programs worldwide, they will tell you this analogy of the room filling up with water is unfortunately absolutely true. And the MAP program is not working, it is strained to its limit already, probably past its limit. That is why, unfortunately, contrary to what is, I think, the normal OECD approach, we don't have the time to spend years in thinking about, can we find a better tool? And I guess one of the reasons why we're harping on this particular mandatory binding arbitration and last best offer is because it is available and it does work, and we have the proof that it does work. So it is key that we move now, that we not go slowly. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard Sliman, please.
Thank you, Chair. I won't repeat, but I would like to stress out that sometimes I have the impression that the discussion is about arbitration, pretty much focusing on OECD countries. And I think what is happening is we're talking in a BEPS environment. We're talking about more than OECD. We're talking about countries with little or no expertise in dealing with maps. And I want to echo Mary Bennett that indicated that it's difficult to actually see specific actions to improve resources of dealing with whatever caseload there may be. And in that respect, I think it is crucial that we're not just thinking about what happened over the last decades, and because that also had a certain time frame and a certain, let's say, circumstances surrounding that, and times change. If you look back 2 years, the total tax environment was totally different than it is at this moment. So for me, that makes thinking about other options than arbitration, with all the, let's say, the sovereignty issues addressed to that, something to consider. And yes, I'm fully in support of arbitration as the best available option to get to results. But at the same time, I pretty much am convinced that there's a lot of countries out there that need support, and that can go both ways. But I would also, let's say, see a mediation type of approach in some sort of cases, and specifically for those countries with little expertise, an opportunity to get outside support, independent support that has expertise, that maybe just convince them to get to a solution. So for me, it would not just be a mediation in the usual sense that may have shown in practice over the last decades that it might not, for whatever reason, be most effective between, let's say, developing expert parties. But here it might just pretty well provide for a situation where parties that are not that familiar, that lack expertise, will support from an expert third-party independent view on how to, let's say, view and potentially resolve the issue without having to be confronted with any type of sovereignty issues. So just want to add that. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got two more people calling for the floor. Let's take those two interventions now, and then we'll go for lunch. And first was Mary Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I think we've heard a number of times how this is an OECD G20 project, and that certainly is clear. If you look at the combination of OECD G20 countries, they represent, we've been told, 90% of world trade. If we could get agreement among the countries that represent 90% of world trade that we're going to commit to this kind of effective dispute resolution, that would be a major advance, and I think that would make people feel much more comfortable about where we're going to end up after BEPS. There may be another 50, 60, 100 countries around the world that don't have that much experience, that need some time to warm up to these things, and that's fine. We can have those discussions. We can talk about whether reasoned opinions are helpful to them or more expensive and unnecessary, or all of those issues can be discussed in the future. But in the short term, it would be great to get the OECD G20 countries that represent the overwhelming part of world trade to commit to something along the lines of arbitration. Even to commit to getting statistics out would be a start for some of them, but let's see if we can do better than that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. And Sim Lowell, please. Oh, it's you. I beg your pardon.
Yes, thank you. I have three very brief remarks. First of all, I think it's important to stress that any arbitration process, in whatever kind of form it is not static and is absolutely flexible and can be tailor-made.
And most of all, maybe even more important, what I've heard so far, is that it's not something you enter and you can't get out of. Many arbitration proceedings are actually settled. And I think that's something that is important. It's not just giving a decision, it's also bringing people around the table, and it sometimes forces to settle, at least helps facilitating settlements or maybe reaching an agreement. Then I wanted also to stress about the fact that was just said, many emerging countries and developing countries are coming to see us, would like to be involved in any type of dispute resolution mechanism, and we are having a lot of training and education on what it actually is. Mediation has developed in very different ways, and you will be surprised to see parties coming at the table with very strict ideas and don't want to compromise, and in the end it was settled. So that too is a very flexible process. That's basically all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's been an extremely useful morning. We've heard what you say, and you've spoken largely with one voice. And thank you for all the comments you've made and all the information that you've helped us with. Let's take our lunch break now and come back at 2 o'clock, please, or maybe a little bit after. Thank you very much.